Howdy my totally tubular gamers, and we are back for another ranking video, and today's is going to be on Guerrilla Games. Yes, we're going to be ranking all of the games by Guerilla Games, the Dutch first-party video game developer based in Amsterdam that is part of the PlayStation Studios brand. They are owned by PlayStation and have put everything out on PlayStation consoles. The studio is probably best known for the Killzone series of games on the PS2, 3, PSP, and PS4, but lately they are much more well known for the Horizon games. And their most recent game release was Horizon Forbidden West, released in current year, 2022. The studio has been one of PlayStation's pillars when it comes to first-party developers for quite some time now, and their games are known for their excellent presentation. Usually when it comes to video game graphics, Guerilla Games is somewhere near the top of everyone's list, with Killzone looking amazing and now Horizon looking amazing. But before we rank all of their games, I think it's important to give a little history on the studio itself. Now, Guerilla Games did not start as Guerilla Games. They were actually founded as Lost Boy Games in 2000. However, Lost Boy Games was actually a merging of three Dutch game companies. These three companies were comprised of developers of older PC titles, like Jazz Jackrabbit, for example. And by 2000, there was about 40 employees. In 2001, Lost Boys merged with Swedish media company Icon Media Lab, and Lost Boy Games was spun off into its own independent entity. And they would get to work on a couple different games. They would actually create 4 games, mostly for the Game Boy Advance. These 4 games would be Dizzy's Candy Quest, Rhino Rumble, Black Belt Challenge, and Invader. I have not played any of these. Shortly after that 4th game, in July of 2003, Lost Boy Games was renamed to Guerilla Games to reflect the style of a new parent company. The developers then began work on 2 big shooter titles, Killzone, in development for the PS2, and Shellshock NAM 67. Both of these titles were much grander than anything Lost Boy Games had ever made. Both of these titles were actually very anticipated, especially Killzone, which had a lot of pre-release hype and was even being dubbed the Halo Killer. Despite obviously not being the Halo Killer, Killzone would actually still be incredibly successful, selling over 1 million units. Shellshock NAM 67, though, was not as successful, and there's a reason you've probably never heard of it. But thanks to Killzone's success, Guerrilla was able to sign an exclusive development agreement with SIE in 2004 that would see future development solely for Sony, so only the PS2, PSP, and PS3. By late 2005, a number of different companies were actually eyeing to just outright purchase Guerilla Games. And it's probably pretty obvious, but Sony Computer Entertainment would actually just straight up buy all of Guerilla Games in December of 2005. Guerilla would then go on to release a number of Killzone games, including Liberation, Killzone 2, Killzone 3, Killzone Shadowfall, and the studio would remain consistent on Sony's platforms. By February 2012, the co-founder would actually leave the studio for Visceral Games. Additionally, Guerilla Games would actually create their own proprietary game engine known as Decima, which would be used by other games such as Until Dawn and Death Stranding. The first game to use this technology was Killzone Shadowfall in 2013. Since then, they've been very steady with their releases on PlayStation consoles and have gained more and more of a reputation and a developer to actually take serious. They would shed the, "oh, it's just the Killzone developer" statement, as now they made Horizon and showed everyone that they could make something other than Killzone. The studio has over 500 people now working for them, and yeah, they're pretty big. And that brings us to today. So yeah, today we're going to be ranking all of the games that Guerilla Games has developed over the years. I won't be looking at their Lost Boy games, as don't have any experience, and we're sticking it to just Guerilla. Now, when it comes to my personal history with Guerilla Games, played Killzone on the PS2, played it on the PS3, tried it on the PS4, and then of course there was Horizon. Now, I wasn't a big Killzone guy. I always thought Killzone was just kind of alright. I wouldn't say I liked it as much as Halo or even Call of Duty, but it was still a serviceable enough shooter. But I got a couple fun Killzone memories. Then of course we have Horizon, which kind of speaks for itself, one of the biggest PlayStation icons and exclusives around, and nowadays Guerilla hits pretty close at home with what I'm working on in real life, so that's cool. And of course this list is going to be outdated at some point. Guerrilla's going to make more games, nobody's doubting that. They've already announced that they're co-developing the next Horizon game, which is a VR game, so there's that, and yeah, it'll be outdated one day. But yeah, we're going to be ranking these games, pretty much based off everything, how I feel about them, how good the games are, how easy it is to come back, all that stuff. Let me know down below your favorite Guerilla game, or maybe you've got some fond memories with one of them. Just let me know something. Like, share, sub, all that. So let's just get right into it. We've already spent enough time dilly-dallying. What do I think is at the bottom of the barrel for Guerilla Games? What's their worst game? Remember how I said nobody remembers or talks about Shellshock and AM67? Well, that's because it's their worst game. This is a very bland and generic shooter that obviously takes place during the Vietnam War in '67. There isn't a whole lot to this game. Not only is there not a lot to this game, there's not a lot good to this game either. I'll be real, this is one of the worst PS2 games I've probably ever touched. This game is like all the hallmarks of a terrible shooter from the time. The first and biggest problem with the game is the controls and how it feels. It feels ridiculously clunky, imprecise, heavy, bloated, slow, you name it. There's not enough aim assist. Shooting enemies is just kind of hard, actually. And that's not good when you're playing a third-person shooter where most of the time, in fact like 90% of the time, you're trying to shoot enemies in very dull, bland, poorly developed environments, and you're having trouble even trying to hit them. You're seemingly wrestling the controls more than anything else. It's just not very well developed, and it's not satisfying in the slightest. The weapon selection, I mean, is fine enough, but it's just not fun to use anything in this game. The AI is also pretty stupid. The environments are unique for gaming, as there isn't a lot of games set in Vietnam, so it gets that, but the objectives and really just what you'll be doing throughout the game is very generic, and it's like been there, done that better in tons of other games, just not necessarily in this setting. It doesn't do anything remotely interesting, and the way that the game handles war and its story in general is very poor. The game has one of the worst takes I've ever seen on the Vietnam War. Like, it just does not take it as seriously as it should. It has you hooking up with Vietnamese women, which probably did happen, but it's very nonchalant about it. Yeah, it's just not a good take. The story's not very good. Really, this game is just not very good. Interestingly enough, there would actually be a sequel to this game, not by Guerrilla, but by Rebellion, that would actually be received even worse than this game. But it's pretty obvious to not even bother with this game. It's just not even worth your time. So our next game is Killzone Liberation, which is an interesting game in the Killzone series, put out by Guerrilla in 2006 on the PSP. So it takes place 2 months after the original Killzone. The Helghast have been defeated temporarily, but the war is far from over. The ISA is still fighting the Helghast. The game sees you play as Jan Templar, and for the most part you are really just trying to save hostages that have been captured. I guess it's neat that it takes place after the original game, so that's cool. Now when it comes to the gameplay, this plays very different from all the other Killzone games for really one big reason. The game is a top-down isometric shooter rather than a first-person shooter. This was definitely done because it's on the PSP, and a first-person shooter on the PSP probably wouldn't have worked so well. But what we have here is a mixture of a shooter and kind of a dungeon crawler, actually, with how these levels are made. There's a lot more freedom to these levels than the original Killzone ever had. You'll be using the iconic Killzone weapon still, obviously shooting from a top-down perspective. You'll still be taking cover to take down these Helghasts who have gotten some upgrades from last time. You'll get in turrets, you'll get in big guns, you'll get in vehicles to kill these guys, and they will do the same to you. The objectives are relatively simple for the most part, but towards the end of the game they do get quite complex as you're trying to navigate hostages. There's kind of a strategic element to it where you get to control either someone on like a squad, basically like a teammate, a buddy, or the hostages trying to tell them where to go. This I thought was okay. It seemed a little shoehorned in, and I feel like it wasn't great with the hostages, like just kind of telling them where to go and controlling them in that aspect. It was like fine enough. Speaking of controls, just like the last game, the controls are kind of an issue in this game. Shooting can feel very imprecise. There's not really any kind of lock-on or aim assist, so you're just kind of shooting out there, and if you're not at mid-range, if you're anything further, good luck hitting these Helghasts. You're going to be shooting a ton before you even hit them. And of course, they have perfect accuracy and can basically snipe you across the screen when you don't even see them on screen. Sometimes I feel like the camera needs to be zoomed out a little bit more. With all that in mind, Killzone Liberation is okay. I would say it's very average. It is very short, and there really isn't a whole lot to it after you beat it. It's just kind of there, and it's really the most forgotten game in the entire Killzone series. But our next game is not forgotten because it is the original Killzone released back in 2004 on the PS2. This was dubbed the Halo Killer, the response from Sony to Halo, the shooter to rival Halo, match Halo, 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 Halo. How about we just let Killzone do its own thing? It obviously didn't kill Halo, and you know, Killzone 1 was a half-decent shooter that wasn't Halo. The game's world, premise, story, and just kind of world building was actually really good. It was probably the best part of like the whole game. The story is actually interesting. Taking place in the far future, humans are really just trying to survive at this point, and we're attacked by the Hellghast. Now, the Hellghast are actually pretty interesting. They're basically just space Nazis, I guess. They think they're superior to us in every way, and they attack, and it's up to the ISA to try to stop them. You play as Captain Jan Templar, who's also trying to stop the Hellghast. In the story, I've only given you the basic premise. It does get a bit more interesting than war, but really what makes it interesting are the Helgen. I actually really like them. I think most people can agree the design of them is actually really well done, and it's more interesting to just look at the design than fight these guys. Despite the good story and the actually pretty decent to good presentation, playing through Killzone is probably the worst part of it. When it comes to actually playing the game, yeah, it's pretty average for the most part to just not that good. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill first-person shooter for the time, where the weapons, the shooting, the squad AI, the level design, the objectives, yeah, it's pretty generic. It's like been there, done that. Obviously, fighting the Hellghast make it more interesting, and the AI for the Hellghast is actually pretty alright, but everything else is just like, eh. The level design is pretty basic. It's very linear, just kind of straight. The objectives you get aren't the most exciting. Your teammates, like your squad AI, it's really not that great. And then the weapons are actually one of the cooler parts of the game. At least these are a little unique. But then the actual shooting is probably like the worst part of the game. In a first-person shooter, like Shellshock, actually, the biggest thing holding this game back is the game's controls and how it feels. It feels like you're underwater. It feels clunky, slow. It feels incredibly imprecise. I swear the hit detection is just kind of off in this game. You'll shoot straight at enemies, the cursor's on them, the reticle's on them, and like it just won't hit them. This does not help that the enemies are super bullet spongy. The frame rate can be kind of all over the place occasionally. And yeah, you kind of got a recipe for disaster for the shooting to just not be that good. And unfortunately, it isn't that good. Most of the time, it's not all that satisfying, and it really holds the entire game back. This game could have been actually a pretty good shooter for the PS2, but what it ends up being is pretty average overall thanks to these issues. And I remember trying this game way back in the day. I was like, oh, Killzone, those guys look cool. I'll fight those guys. And I got the game for dirt cheap and tried it for like a couple hours and was just like, I don't really love this game very much. And all these years later, I still don't really like this game all that much. And so here we have Killzone Shadowfall, released by Guerrilla in 2013 as a PlayStation 4 launch title. Pretty crazy that it's almost 10 years old now. Now, I remember when Shadowfall came out, and I remember a lot of people weren't too happy with it. They weren't satisfied with the gameplay. Everyone loved the presentation, but they just thought it was more Killzone, and I don't know, I guess because it was the launch of a new console, people wanted something different. But the story, premise, and setting certainly isn't, though. So after Killzone 3, I'll just say that the Hellghast, they live on half of the planet, with the humans on the other half, and there's a giant wall separating them. Naturally, tensions arise and conflict ensues. The story is just really stupid, especially the ending, and the entire world just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, it doesn't even make a lot of sense for Killzone. And geez, you thought the characters in the first 3 games were kind of generic, gruff military dudes? This is even worse. These are just some of the most generic characters you'll find in like any video game. The writing is very basic and just kind of shallow, and when it comes to the story and the world building and all that, I think they just majorly drop the ball. But I'll tell you where they didn't drop the ball was with the Decima engine. This game looks, feels, and sounds amazing, and the shooting might be the best shooting in the entire series. It's actually very satisfying. It doesn't feel super slow and clunky. The aiming is actually very well done, and I think, yeah, the shooting is actually good and it's fun. And yeah, it is generally satisfying with a pretty good roster of weapons, and the way that the enemies die, oh, it's all good. And the AI is actually relatively good also. Something that's different from the other Killzone games is that Shadowfall tries to have a more open-ended level design and allows players to use like stealth in their missions, or allows you to take some different routes. It's nothing like too crazy, and it is pretty linear still, but it mixes it up from Killzone 3 in a way that I actually did enjoy. And you know, stealth was not something I realized I would actually like in Killzone, but I actually did like the stealth in this game. It's nothing like crazy, and it's not like expertly made, but I don't know, I thought it was alright. Well, I thought the game's story was pretty dumb for the most part. I think the campaign was pretty decent. I mean, it wasn't like amazing. I wouldn't say it's like one of the best first-person shooter campaigns on the PS4. I wouldn't even say it's in like the top 50, but I would say that it was alright. And then when it came to the multiplayer, I was never too into it. I remember just trying it and being like, it's just kind of more Killzone, more kind of that overrated generic shooter that it didn't really interest me all that much, and I didn't really bother with it. And so should you even play Shadowfall nowadays? I mean, it's dirt cheap, so that helps, but probably not. It's just a pretty average first-person shooter as well. But here's a game I like a bit more, Killzone 3, released by Guerrilla in 2011 for the PS3. Now, Killzone 3 really kind of just looks at Killzone 2, and they tried to improve it, but in my opinion, they kind of made some tweaks that made me not like it as much. The story takes place right after Killzone 2, like legit right after, so I'm not going to spoil what happens, but I'm going to just say that the Helghast are in disarray and they're having their own political conflicts. And then the ISA is just kind of stuck in the middle of it and they're just kind of screwed. When it comes to the story, I think it's good. The Helghasts are much more interesting than the ISA. Seeing their political struggles is way more entertaining and interesting and well done than anything the ISA has. They're just pretty boring and generic dudes, really. And while I think the story is fine, I do prefer the grittier, more serious, dark nature of Killzone 2. I think that's when the series was at its best. When it comes to the environments, it's kind of the same thing. Killzone 3 is all over the place with winter wonderlands and these freaking, like, giant alien forests and factories. And yeah, you just kind of go all over. The variety is definitely there when it comes to the design and the levels. And the levels they're certainly more interesting than Killzone 1. I'll give them that. The level design is actually designed. And the game has a fair amount of interesting set pieces, particularly with the jetpack. That's probably like the newest thing that they added to Killzone 3. They add this jetpack that you can use in a couple levels, and you know, it was fine enough. It's cool to use something a little different, and it mixes it up a bit. But when it comes to actually playing through the game, I mean, it feels pretty similar to Killzone 2 for the most part. They even just really ramp it up from Killzone 2. Like, the game just kind of starts you off in the deep end where Killzone 2 left off. And the pacing, it just kind of continues from there, where it just keeps going higher and higher till it's just at ridiculous moments. And I feel like the same kind of goes for the difficulty, is you'll find yourself just getting totally owned in like a second, tons of times, where you don't even know where the enemies are, and it happened more frequently than I'd like it to happen, that's for sure. It just seems that some of the areas weren't designed all that well, but there are some really well designed areas, like this one where you fight this giant walker towards the end of the game. That was actually pretty good. And I'd say the campaign is alright. I wouldn't say it's particularly great, but I would say it's alright. The multiplayer, I remember thinking, was just okay as well. It doesn't even go online anymore, and you could play the game in co-op for the story mode, which is probably better than how it is single player. But I remember the multiplayer was just not as good as Killzone 2 with not as much customization. And I really think that the best thing about Killzone is the presentation. It looks absolutely amazing. It sounds amazing. All of that. Nobody's going to deny that. That just is absolutely phenomenal. But everything else, I think, is just pretty okay at best. And I don't know, call me a hater, but I never thought Killzone 3 was all that. I thought it was just kind of slightly above average. And is it even worth playing now? Maybe. And so here we have what I believe to be the best Killzone game, and that is Killzone 2, released by Guerrilla in 2009. Now, I'm sure what everyone immediately brings up with Killzone 2 is that initial presentation by Sony, where that's not what the game looked, but the game still looks absolutely amazing. This game is like 10 plus years old, and it looks still very stunning, and the sound design is great. But actually playing Killzone 2 nowadays, yeah, it's still pretty alright. When it comes to the premise and the story and the setting, I actually do think it does continue that interesting arc from the first game. It takes place after the first game. The ISA is still going after the Helghast. And you know, these guys are actually pretty interesting. They're really more developed in 2. I think they're the most interesting part of the game, way better than the ISA. And I think that the world is actually decently well made. It's one of the better parts of the game. The game is very gritty and serious and dark, not only literally, but in tone as well. And I know that a lot of people really like Killzone 2's dark nature and just how gritty and serious it was, even compared to the other Killzones. And I gotta agree, I think it makes for the best overall feel. It is the most interesting, and it's the most different from a lot of the other shooters. But when it comes to the gameplay, yeah, it does feel pretty similar to other shooters. Obviously, the control scheme is different, and a lot of people had trouble understanding that. But I mean, it's fine enough. It does feel a bit floaty and a little slow at times. But it's nothing awful, and it's not like the first game, and I do appreciate that there is some weight with these weapons. I think that is nice. But the actual gameplay, yeah, pretty standard stuff if we're being real. You shoot a lot of Helghast, you take cover to regenerate health, a lot of ADSing. There are some cool set pieces in there where you're in a vehicle, or you're just killing a bunch of them. But I do generally think that when it comes to the pacing, the shooting, and how satisfying this campaign was, it is the best of the whole series. This also might be the hardest of the whole series. There are a couple parts of this campaign that really will just kick your teeth in and will not let you go. Like, they are actually pretty difficult. Don't even get me started on Radic. But yeah, I think this is the best paced campaign, and if you're going to play any of the Killzone games, you probably should try Killzone 2 if you really want to try the Killzone games. I guess Killzone 2 would be the best one to try. Killzone 2 is also the only game that I have any fond or even half decent memories with when it comes to multiplayer. I remember the multiplayer actually being pretty fun and having some fun back in the day, like in high school playing with a couple buddies. The customization was pretty good, but sadly, like Killzone 3, it doesn't go online anymore. Killzone in general has just never really been my series. I think it is massively overrated, if we're being honest. I think the presentation's amazing and it made people overlook like the whole game just because it looked amazing and felt pretty alright. I'd say the series is ultimately very middling, as most of the games are either average or slightly above average, with Killzone 2 being the only one to even get past that, in my opinion. I think it's just like, yeah, it's alright. But I would not recommend the Killzone series to anybody, especially at this point in time, and I won't be making a video on the series because it's just really not worth playing, in my opinion. But Guerrilla understood that people were pretty sick of Killzone and weren't really interested in that anymore, and so they left the Killzone series. And Guerrilla would go on to make Horizon Zero Dawn for the PS4 in 2017. Now, compared to Killzone, Horizon really felt like a breath of fresh air, as it was very different from Killzone. It was, first off, single-player oriented, and it was open world. The story, setting, and characters are incredibly interesting. I'd say the setting is one of the most interesting settings of the last, 10 years in games. Like, it's post-apocalyptic, far, far in the future, where humans are scattered and in tribes and really just trying to scrounge around to survive. And there are these giant robot dinosaurs that live on the planet as well, and they also pretty much just kill everything. So the humans are just trying to survive, but the robots are basically destroying everything. Everything is super overgrown, and I'm not going to go any further than that because the world is actually really well designed. The lore is actually really interesting, and trying to figure out what happened, really awesome. And then there's Aloy, our main character. You start as a young girl for her, as she's just part of some tribe just trying to survive as well, but quickly finds out that she's a lot more interesting and important to this world than she initially thought. Now, while Horizon Zero Dawn has a lot of elements from other open world games that came out around this time, it really does try to do its own thing, and it mixes and matches everything in such a way that is actually pretty different, where it still feels a little familiar, but parts of it are just totally unfamiliar. It is a giant, sprawling open world game where you are dropped into this giant map and you can do missions for tons of different characters. There's obviously story missions and side missions where you help other tribes. There's some collectibles. This game has crafting, and then there's the combat. The combat is just completely different from like any other open world game. It's like they took the hunts from Monster Hunter. Now, if you've ever played Monster Hunter, you know that the hunts are very long. Usually you got to find the monster, and then actually fighting and hunting and taking down the monster can take upwards of even 30 to 40 minutes. They took that and made it like 2-3 minutes. They really made it bite-sized. They crunched it down and made it incredibly interesting. Horizon Zero Dawn has some of the best combat you'll find in any open world game, except the melee combat. The melee combat sucks, but everything else is incredibly well done. Actually engaging with these machines is really great. They all behave in erratic different behaviors, and they all have different patterns with them. They have different strategies. They're all actually really different to fight. You can't fight two machines the same way, really. Of course, fighting the humans isn't going to be as interesting, but when you start fighting those bigger, badder machines, things get really interesting. Not only because the machines are actually difficult to fight and actually put up a good fight, but Aloy gets a ton to do as well. She has a ton of different ways that she can attack these things, whether it's her traps, her bow and arrow. There's a ton of different options. And the game really does reward your creativity. Setting up a ton of traps or making like a little maze almost with tripwires for these creatures, yeah, you will just totally take them down real fast, and it is really satisfying. The game does have some other elements though. One of the game's core mechanics is crafting. A lot of this game is crafting. I've never honestly liked the crafting. I think it kind of sucks, but it's here. There's hunting, which also kind of ties into the crafting. Then you can even eventually hack some of these creatures. You can hack them and have them join you. You can ride them, and this is fun. And I think that the environments not only look amazing, but are actually decently designed, and they're all pretty varied from each other. You really do go on a journey here. And while I don't think a lot of the side content is amazing, I can say that it's better than most Ubisoft side content, which is probably the most comparable for this game. But you know, despite being a little bit of a Ubisoft side quest kind of thing, they actually do throw a unique twist in it. For instance, instead of climbing tall tower to see everything, it's now these tall necks and they're moving around and you got to figure out how to get up there. I like that. But yeah, Horizon Zero Dawn really was Guerrilla's biggest challenge, and I think it absolutely paid off because I think this game is just leagues above Killzone. I had much more fun, I was much more interested, and I think that it was just a more satisfying experience versus any of the Killzone games. I'm not going to say it's perfect. I will say that the pacing is actually kind of poor in this game. It starts really slow, and I've known a couple people who just kind of dropped the game before even the 10-hour mark because of how slow it was going, and you know, I did as well, but I did come back to it, and after you get past that initial hump, I think that it really picks up, it gets a lot more interesting, and it gets a lot better, and the gameplay is a lot more fun. And if you haven't tried Zero Dawn yet, I would think it's definitely worth trying. I know it was kind of ignored because of Breath of the Wild when it came out, but I think it's definitely worth trying still, and I've always had a nice time with this game. And the DLC Frozen Wilds, nothing to scoff at either. It is good, but it's not their very best game in my opinion. I think Guerrilla's best game is actually their latest game, Horizon Forbidden West, which is obviously the sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn, taking place like right after and sees Aloy kind of traveling across a destroyed America to save the world. I won't go any further into the details of the story, but I actually quite enjoyed it and thought it was about as interesting as the first game. It is a very different story and world from the first game, and it is much more sci-fi, and I know some people probably aren't going to like the story anywhere near as much, but I really did enjoy it. I liked where it went, I liked the twists and turns, and I thought that it was also really interesting and really well developed. Well, that first game was about Aloy. It was kind of almost her origin story, and it was all about establishing her. This game is all about the other characters in this world, and I think that they're actually just as strong, if not actually stronger than Aloy sometimes, because they are really well done also. Speaking of well done, we have the presentation. This game just looks absolutely phenomenal on the PS5. Like, it looks incredible. It runs great. It sounds great. The controller with the haptic feedback and all that, ooh, it's really cool. I really do like it. The presentation is awesome. But it's not just the presentation I think that's awesome. I think that this game really is quite a bit better than Zero Dawn. I think that it improves on Zero Dawn's formula in numerous ways, and I think that it is their best game overall. And after playing through Forbidden West, it really makes me go like, huh, Guerrilla's not a developer to mess around with. I mean, they made some pretty alright shooters with the Killzone games, and Zero Dawn was pretty good, but this game is actually pretty great. Like Zero Dawn, it does feel very familiar to other open world games, especially some Ubisoft ones, but Zero Dawn was not as open as Forbidden West. Forbidden West is a lot more open, non-linear, and they give you a lot more to do and explore. It feels more like Breath of the Wild. You can even turn off like all the markers and where everything is, and you can just kind of go out and explore, and I really do appreciate that. And there really is a lot to explore with this world. Obviously there's your main missions, and then there's some side missions. The side missions though are a lot better developed than Zero Dawn's. These are a lot more interesting. They really do try to make them just as interesting as the main quest, and while I didn't do a ton of them, I did do a fair amount of them. And yeah, they are as interesting, if not just a little less. I really did like the character missions though. But aside from that, there's hunts, there's arenas, there's ruins to explore, there's treasure to find, there's parts to find. The tall necks return, and this is like one of my favorite parts of the game because these became like an entire puzzle of how to get on the tall neck, much better than the first game, and it really is unique. There's not many other games that are interesting like this. And obviously you can still hack the machines to help you traverse through this giant open world. Now, something about this open world is it's actually kind of difficult to traverse in, because you see in a lot of open world games like Ghost of Tsushima, everything's just really flat. You just kind of run forward, you run straight. Even Grand Theft Auto mostly does this with its open worlds. You just kind of go straight, do some turns occasionally. No, not in Horizon Forbidden West. This open world is very vertical. There is lots of mountains, and there's a lot of stuff in your way. Traversing this open world is a challenge in itself, which is actually really interesting, and I don't know why more games haven't done that. The climbing in this game is pretty fine. It's not amazing. I'd say it's like about as good as Uncharted's. It's really cool how you can scan the environment and climb stuff. And they knew that the game was going to be super vertical, so they give you a hang glider basically, and yeah, it is kind of like the one in Breath of the Wild, but you know, it's pretty fun to use in this game also. But then we get to the combat. Now the combat looks at Zero Dawn, it looks at how open and interesting it was, and then yeah, it makes it even more open and interesting. Not only do like all of the machines return from the first game, they introduce a ton of new machines. They actually mix up some of the old machines and give them some new move sets, some new weak points, some new strategies. And yeah, fighting these machines is fantastic. I would say that this might be the best combat of like any open world game in the last like decade. It is really well done. I really enjoyed fighting all of these monsters and creatures and dinosaurs and everything in between, because it is actually really well done. Almost every encounter feels like totally different from the last. Like no two encounters go exactly the same way. And I really do like how interesting it stays. Like 30, 40 hours into the game, and the way you're encountering these monsters and machines is like different from how you were before, and the enemies are still attacking you in new and different ways. Like it's really awesome, and it's super satisfying when you take down one of those giant big bad boys. And I think that the game feels a hell of a lot better than Zero Dawn did. I think that the environments are better designed. I think the fights are better designed. And you know, I don't really have all that much to complain with. I know a lot of people don't like that Aloy talks like the whole game. That didn't really bother me. I get why it's there. One thing though I didn't like about the game is the crafting does return. I think it still sucks. This isn't fun. I don't know why it's here. It's unnecessary, I feel like. And I don't really like the whole game's economy, how you have to go find very specific parts to make very essential items. Like, I've done this so many times in open world games, especially like Far Cry. I don't really want to do this in games anymore. I don't like the crafting stuff. But aside that, I think that the game is really great. I think that it's one of the better open world games in the last couple years. Obviously, it's not Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, both of which came out like right when Horizon did, and a lot of people seem to ignore Horizon, but don't ignore Horizon. Forbidden West is actually pretty good. Not a ton of people talked about it because of Elden Ring, and you know, that's a shame because it's worth playing. And yeah, that's why I think it's their best game. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you people enjoyed it. Let me know down below what you think of this whole, like, ranking every game in the studio. I think it's pretty fun. It was a good way to talk about Horizon since there wasn't enough games to rank, and I really did want to talk about it. Hope everyone has a fantastic day. Let me know down below what you thought. See you later. Bye-bye.